For nearly 3 decades, the island at Althorpe had kept it secret. Surrounded by water, accessible only by a small boat, the grave of Princess Diana sat in deliberate isolation, protected, private, and undisturbed. No cameras, no visitors, no intrusion from the outside world that had consumed her while she lived. The woman who had been chased across continents, photographed at her most vulnerable, and dissected by a global press machine had finally, in death, been granted the one thing she rarely experienced in life: peace. But on a quiet morning in the spring of 2024, that peace was broken. A small team arrived at Althorpe Estate before the sun had fully risen. The grounds were sealed. Staff had been given limited information. Security was discreet but thorough. Among those present was Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, Diana's younger brother, the man who had delivered her eulogy with trembling fury in Westminster Abbey all those years ago, the man who had wept openly while a watching world wept with him. He was now the custodian of his sister's resting place, and it was he who had ultimately sanctioned what was about to happen. 27 years after Princess Diana was laid to rest, her tomb was being opened. The decision to disturb the grave had not come easily, nor had it come suddenly. It had been years in the making, driven initially by practicality rather than sentiment. The island at Althorpe, however beautiful, presented an unusual engineering challenge. Diana's burial chamber was not constructed in a conventional church or mausoleum, as is typical for aristocratic families of the Spencer standing. It was an outdoor site, surrounded by water, exposed to the full force of English seasons, freezing winters, waterlogged springs, the relentless creep of moisture through soil and stone. Earl Spencer had commissioned a structural survey some years before the tomb was finally opened. Engineers assessed the burial chamber and found what many had feared. The combination of water exposure, ground movement, and the passage of nearly 3 decades had begun to take a toll on the site's integrity. The concerns were not yet critical, but they were serious enough to demand attention before they became irreversible. Doing nothing was no longer a responsible option. British law added another layer of complexity. Private burial sites in the United Kingdom are subject to specific regulations and periodic legal reviews, particularly after certain intervals of time have passed. The 27-year mark carried its own legal weight, triggering obligations around site maintenance, structural compliance, and official documentation. The Spencer family had responsibilities not only as guardians of Diana's memory, but as landowners accountable to existing burial laws. These legal factors gave additional structure to a decision that was, at its core, deeply personal. And then there were her sons. William and Harry had grown into men who had spent the better part of their adult lives wrestling with their mother's absence. Both had spoken publicly, in their own ways, about the lasting wound of losing her so young. William had been 15. Harry had been 12. They had walked behind her coffin through the streets of London while the world watched, their grief visible, their youth heartbreaking. Now, nearly 3 decades later, they wanted to know that the place where their mother lay was protected and preserved. They wanted reassurance that time and nature had not done to her grave what the paparazzi and press had done to her life, violated it, damaged it, left it exposed. The decision to open the tomb was therefore never just about engineering reports or legal schedules. It was about a family trying to honor a woman they had loved and lost, trying to ensure that her final resting place remained worthy of her. What none of them fully anticipated was what they would find inside. The operation was conducted with the kind of quiet precision that defined its purpose. Experts in structural preservation, conservation, and funeral services had been carefully selected, each one briefed on the gravity of the occasion and bound by strict confidentiality agreements. No detail had been left to chance. The process had been planned for weeks, with every step documented, every movement considered. The estate itself felt different that morning, stiller than usual, as if even the grounds understood the weight of what was happening. The lake surrounding the island caught the early light in fragments. Swans moved slowly across the water. A small boat carried the team across to the island in near silence. Inside the burial chamber, time had done less damage than feared. The structure had held. The protective elements of the original construction had performed their function with quiet reliability. The coffin remained intact. For those present, the initial wave of relief was immediately followed by something harder to name, a feeling of sudden, overwhelming proximity to grief. This was not an abstract historical site. This was where Diana lay. The air in that chamber carried something that technical language could not adequately describe. Engineers moved carefully, taking measurements and notes. Photographs were taken for official records. Every action was deliberate and respectful. But it was not the structural assessment that would define this day. It was something else entirely, something that nobody had documented, nobody had anticipated, and nobody had been prepared to find. Nestled within the burial chamber, alongside the known contents of the grave, were items that had never appeared on any official funeral inventory. Objects and sealed envelopes that had either been placed at the time of burial with extraordinary secrecy or introduced at some point afterward by someone with private access. Whatever their origin, their presence was unmistakable, and in an instant, the nature of the operation transformed entirely. The structural survey could wait. Something far more significant had just been uncovered. Among the items discovered were sealed envelopes, carefully preserved, deliberately placed, and addressed in handwriting that those present immediately recognized. Diana had written letters. She had written them before she died, arranged for them to be placed in her tomb, and waited, across whatever distance separates the living from the dead, for them to be found. The envelopes were addressed to specific individuals: William, Harry, Charles Spencer, others whose names have not been publicly confirmed. The letters had not been left carelessly. They had been prepared with intention, as though Diana had known, or at least considered, that one day someone would open this place and find them waiting. The letter addressed to William was, by all accounts, the most carefully composed. Diana had written to her eldest son about his future, about the role that history had already determined for him before he was old enough to choose it himself. She wrote about kingship not as an institution but as a human responsibility, urging him toward the kind of leadership built on genuine connection rather than performed duty. She wrote about the pitfall she had witnessed from inside the royal machinery, the emotional distances, the institutional coldness, the way the system could slowly hollow out the people it claimed to honor. She asked him to resist that hollowing. She asked him, above all, to love openly and without apology. The letter to Harry was different in tone, raw, more intimate, more urgent. Diana had understood her younger son in ways that perhaps even Harry had not fully recognized. She had seen his sensitivity, his restlessness, the particular vulnerability that came with being the spare rather than the heir. She wrote to him about identity, about the danger of letting royal expectation override the person he actually was. She encouraged him to be honest, even when honesty was inconvenient, even when it cost him the approval he had always sought. The letter was, in the estimation of those who later became aware of its contents, both prophetic and heartbreaking, as though Diana had looked across the years and seen exactly the struggles that awaited her boy. To her brother Charles, Diana wrote about legacy and memory. She asked him to protect her story, not in the sense of managing it or controlling it, but in the sense of guarding its truth. She expressed her wishes about how she wanted to be remembered, not as a tragic figure, not as a royal footnote, but as a woman who had tried, imperfectly and passionately, to live according to her values. She trusted her brother with the weight of that responsibility, and the letter made clear how much she valued the bond between them, a bond that had existed long before crowns and cameras had entered their lives. The remaining letters, addressed to individuals who have not yet been identified publicly, remain sealed or under private review. Their existence alone raises profound questions about the relationships Diana held closest in her final years, the people she trusted with her most unguarded thoughts. What strikes observers most forcefully about these letters is not simply their content but the act of writing them. Diana wrote these messages knowing she would not be alive to deliver them in person. She took time, in the months or years before her death, to think carefully about the people she loved and what she needed them to know. She then arranged, through means still not entirely clear, for those messages to survive her and wait inside the most private space she would ever occupy. This was not a spontaneous gesture. It was a deliberate, profound act of love stretched across time. Beyond the personal letters, the tomb yielded something more unsettling: documents. Papers that had no business being there, by any official account. Records, notes, and written observations that Diana had apparently gathered, preserved, and hidden with a care that suggested she understood their potential significance. The contents of these documents have not been publicly released in full, and it is unlikely they will be made available to the public in the near term. But sources familiar with their general nature have described materials that cover a wide range of territory: financial arrangements within the royal household, accounts of conversations Diana considered significant enough to record, observations about palace decision-making that conflicted with public presentations, and detailed notes about incidents she found troubling or threatening. Diana had famously written a letter before her death stating that she believed an attempt would be made on her life, that her car's brakes would be tampered with, and that the attack would be designed to clear the way for Prince Charles to remarry. That letter had become one of the most debated documents in contemporary royal history. But the papers found in her tomb suggest that such concerns were not isolated. Diana, it appears, had been keeping records for some time, building what amounted to a private archive of her experiences inside an institution that she believed had not always dealt with her honestly or safely. The significance of these documents, if their contents are suggested, cannot be overstated. Diana's public accounts of her royal experience, most famously in the 1995 Panorama interview, had always been partially dismissed or contextualized by palace insiders as the perspective of a distressed woman rather than an objective account. These buried documents represent something harder to dismiss: a private record, compiled without any public audience in mind, reflecting Diana's unfiltered understanding of her own situation. What happens to these papers now is the subject of intense deliberation. Earl Spencer, as the custodian of Althorpe and the person who holds legal authority over the estate and its contents, has so far declined to make any of the materials publicly accessible. He has also, reportedly, resisted pressure from palace representatives who sought information about the document contents. His position appears to be one of cautious stewardship, neither rushing to expose nor rushing to conceal, but moving carefully in a situation where every decision carries enormous weight. William's preference, according to those close to the situation, aligns with continued privacy. The future king has spent years navigating the tension between his mother's legacy and his obligations to the institution he will one day lead. He is understood to believe that releasing sensitive documents from his mother's tomb would cause more harm than good, reopening wounds, destabilizing relationships, and potentially distorting Diana's memory through the lens of modern political and media agendas. Harry's position is reportedly the opposite. The Duke of Sussex, who has already chosen a path of radical transparency regarding his royal experience, most visibly through his memoir and various media appearances, is said to view these documents as important evidence of truths that deserve acknowledgement. He sees the hiding of difficult history as a continuation of the patterns that wounded both his mother and himself. The disagreement between the brothers over this question is, in many ways, a distillation of the larger conflict that has defined their relationship for years. It is not merely a dispute about privacy versus disclosure. It is a fundamental difference in how each man has processed their mother's life and death, what they believe they owe her memory, and what they believe the world owes her legacy. News of the tomb opening and its discoveries reached Buckingham Palace quickly, and the reaction was far from calm. King Charles III found himself in an acutely